Hello, this video is on the pieces of equipment that we will find that we commonly use in our lab this year. The first piece of equipment is a beaker. It's important that you know the size of the beaker you're working with. You can have a 250 milliliter beaker, you can have a 500 milliliter beaker, and sometimes they're even larger than that. So beakers' jobs are to hold and mix liquids. Pay close attention to that function because we're going to have a little bit of a subtle difference between a beaker and a test tube and an Erlenmeyer flask and a graduated cylinder here over in the next few slides. So pay close attention that the beaker's job is just to hold and mix liquids. It does not say to measure, despite the fact that there might be measurements on the side of the beaker. The second piece of equipment is the microscope. Its job is to view objects too small to be seen with the naked eye. We'll have a whole lab on the microscope here in a few weeks too. The next piece of equipment is the triple beam balance. It is to weigh objects and it weighs in grams. You'll get some more experience with this later this week as well. The next is the graduated cylinder. The graduated cylinder function is to measure liquids. Now, that's where I wanted you to pay close attention. The beaker is to hold and mix, but the graduated cylinder is to measure. The reason for that is it's much more specific, and we are able to measure right down to the single unit of milliliters or liters or whatever you're using. So it's much more specific to use the graduated cylinder than to use the beaker for measuring liquids. The next piece of equipment is a piece of safety equipment, the goggles. They are to protect your eyes. Don't think that needs any more explanation. But next we have the Bunsen burner. It is used for heating, sterilization, and combustion. Hate to break it to you, but we will not be using that piece of equipment in the lab this year. You will get to use it in chemistry in the future, and it does have functions in biology. We just won't be using it this year. So it's an open flame used to sterilize, especially when we're growing bacteria and such. The next is a hot plate. It is an alternative to the Bunsen burner, typically used to heat glassware and its contents. So hot plates are much more common, and you'll be using those quite frequently in this class. The next are beaker tongs. They help you to hold and move beakers as they may be hot or have caustic chemicals in them. So they are suited just for beakers, and you can't really pick up anything else because of the shape of the beaker tongs. Next we have the test tube. The function of the test tube is to hold chemicals, and it can be used to perform smaller experiments. So things on a very small scale that you won't necessarily be able to see it in a beaker, you can use the test tube. The next piece of equipment are the test tube tongs. Just like the beaker tongs, they help to move equipment, move test tubes. So they're shaped just for test tubes, and they wouldn't work on a beaker because they're much smaller. The next is the thermometer. The thermometer measures temperature of a substance, and units that we use in science are Celsius and Kelvin. So we won't use Kelvin at all, but all temperature recording should be made in Celsius degrees. The next is the Petri dish. Usually that's used to grow bacteria, but it can also be used to make small observations on a very small scale. The next piece of equipment are the forceps, and they look a lot like tweezers, but they're for grasping and holding objects. We call them forceps, not tweezers, though, so pay close attention to that one. Next we have the Erlenmeyer flask. The Erlenmeyer flask is used for storing liquids. It also has measurements much like the beaker would, but it's not specific. So we use the graduated cylinder to measure our liquids, then we can use the funnel, which is the next item, to pour liquid into the Erlenmeyer flask put a stopper in it, and store liquids till a later date. So the funnel is used for transferring liquids. And then the magnifying glass is to magnify objects that might be difficult to see with the naked eye. Next we have the dissection tray, or a dissecting tray. This is what we use to hold specimen. It kind of looks like a brownie pan when you look at it up close, but it's what we use to hold specimens for dissection. It has a rubber mat in the bottom that keeps the specimen from moving around, but also it won't be harmed by scalpels and things like that. The next piece of equipment is the test tube rack. It's used to hold test tubes upright to facilitate working with them. So it might hold a test tube while you work with it. It might hold test tubes while you store them. The next is a scalpel. These are used for surgery, dissection, and for cutting. So we won't be using these this year either, but scalpels are used when you make any kind of cut in a dissection. Next is a microscope slide. They are the platform for viewing objects under the microscope. So you might put a little piece of, let's say for example when we do the microscope lab, you'll put a piece of hair on the slide and observe that underneath the microscope. And the last piece of equipment is the centrifuge. That spins test tubes and forces heavier components to the bottom of the tube. So just to give you an idea of how quickly that centrifuge spins, it spins at 5,000 rotations per minute to separate blood. And in a car, the rotations that the engine has to make to go 60 miles per hour is only roughly 2,500 RPMs. So it's like a car going at 120 miles an hour. So pretty quickly.